Thank you everyone for being here tonight. This event format was impromptu and it was because of safety concerns. I would like to first announce that we are going to have a Q&A at the end of this event. So please ask your questions in the chat. The Q&A will probably last around 10 to 15 minutes depending on time. Now, more than ever, it is necessary to protect First Amendment rights, which are the cornerstone of a free and open society. I do not want to live in Antifa's America. I do not want to live in a society in which journalists are persecuted for the topics they choose to cover. Andy Ngo is a journalist best known for reporting on Antifa and uncovering the illegal activities that they would rather remain hidden. And he is one of the few courageous journalists willing to cover this topic. Antifa attempts to threaten and intimidate anyone who tries to expose them. Andy is no exception. He has been sent death threats, followed, harassed, doxxed, and has had his location published in real time. Antifa has shown up at his family's home and made it unsafe for him to live in this country. They have physically assaulted him multiple times. This is domestic terror. Andy has recently published a new book, Unmasked, Inside Antifa's Radical Plan to Destroy Democracy, which documents how Antifa organizes, operates, and threatens violence towards anyone who opposes their radical agenda. On the other side of this story is our second guest, Gabe Nadales, who is formerly part of an Antifa group. He is here today to share his story.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, and to the student organizers and everyone who is continuing in stride despite these circumstances. I apologize to those who are joining the live stream that if you had made the journey out to Hanover, New Hampshire, that you were unable to see Gabriel and I live today. On the 20th of October, 1981, a 38-year-old woman named Kathy dropped off her infant with a babysitter near Nyack, New York. She then waited as a passenger inside a rented van near a shopping mall. But Kathy wasn't about to go shopping or to go to work. She was a far-left violent extremist and a member of the May 19th Communist organization. The group described itself as militantly anti-racist and anti-capitalist. It had the stated goal of abolishing the criminal justice system and toppling the US government because of systemic racism. From a well-to-do New York family, Kathy felt guilty for being white and wanted to be more than an ally to her Black communist comrades. She wanted to become an accomplice. So on that day, she acted as a lookout and decoy in the getaway van. Nearby, her armed comrades from the Black Liberation Army launched a shooting attack on Brink's guards loading money into a van from the mall. They used a shotgun and M16 to open fire on the guardsmen. Peter Page was killed instantly. A second guard was severely injured, and a third inside the truck barely survived by hiding underneath the dashboard. The shooters made off with about $1.6 million in cash. That's about $4.6 million today. Kathy, nearby, believed the money was a form of reparations for Blacks and would be used to support a Black ethno-state free from capitalism and white supremacy. After the shooting, the terrorists drove to where Kathy and other white accomplices were to swap vehicles. One of the accomplices was Kathy's boyfriend, David Gilbert, the father of their infant. The plan was to confuse law enforcement by using white getaway drivers while the armed Black shooters hid in the back with the money. The plan worked until police pulled over the van that Kathy was in. When they did so, she pretended to be scared and pleaded with them to lower their guns. When they did, 6 of her armed comrades in body armor jumped out of the truck and fired upon the cops with automatic rifles. Nyack police officers Edward O'Grady and Waverly Brown were shot to death. Another detective was seriously wounded but survived. A 4th officer was inside his vehicle. In an attempt to kill or maim the last officers, the shooters tried ramming his vehicle with the getaway van. He managed to fire shotgun rounds at the truck before it crashed into his police cruiser. The shooters then dispersed into a second getaway vehicle while others carjacked a nearby driver. Kathy tried escaping on foot, but was apprehended. In 1984, Kathy Boudin pleaded guilty to murder and robbery and was sentenced to 20 years in prison. The year prior, her boyfriend, David Gilbert, was convicted and sentenced to 75 years in life for murder. Their baby, Chessa, was given to be raised by fellow far-left terrorists Bill Ayers and Bernardine Dorn. They're circled in the red in the slide. Both were leaders of the Weather Underground, a communist group that carried out bombings across the US in the 1960s and 70s. Chessa Boudin was raised in a left-wing radicalist family, and in 2019, as a 38-year-old man, was elected as the district attorney in San Francisco, California. His campaign was supported by George Soros money. After serving a 20-year sentence, Kathy Boudin became a professor at Columbia University. Chessa's father was supposed to be serving 75 years to life for his murder convictions, but was commuted by former Democrat New York Governor Andrew Cuomo in his final hours in office last year before his disgraceful resignation. In celebration of the announcement, District Attorney Chessa Boudin tweeted out a photo of him and his father. He did not mention the names of the 3 people his father was involved in murdering. This incident, where Black nationalism, white guilt, far-left radicalism, communist politics, and insurrectionary beliefs came together, resulting in deaths, happened 40 years ago. But I know that each and every one of you recognize things about it that make it sound like it's something that could happen today. I recount this story because despite politicians, dominant culture, and establishment media telling you that the right has a monopoly on violent extremism, this country has in fact been dealing with far-left domestic terrorism for about half a century. Groups like the Weather Underground, the May 19th Communist Organization, the Black Liberation Army, and others carried out deadly shootings, bombings, and robberies in the 1960s and 1970s to wage war on the United States in the name of anti-racism and anti-fascism. Sound familiar? Today, militant individuals, groups, and movements associated with communists, Antifa, and Black Lives Matter carry out campaigns of terror that have resulted in burnt down neighborhoods, destruction to local economies, violent attacks on government property and law enforcement, and yes, even political assassination. In fact, just speaking about this event has caused Antifa groups in the Northeastern United States to threaten violence. They don't want you to hear me or Gabriel speak, and they'll threaten violence to try and keep people away. Unfortunately, they succeeded in part today. Although Gabriel and I traveled thousands of miles to be here at Dartmouth College in person, we are unable to do a live event because of serious security concerns flagged by the administration. Earlier today, law enforcement sent bomb-sniffing dogs throughout the campus building. The New Hampshire Journal published a report yesterday detailing some of Antifa's efforts to stop this event. Quote, Ngo is set to speak Thursday night along with Gabe Nadales, a reported former member of Antifa. News of the appearance got members of Antifa organized into planning a counter-protest, with some making threats to stop Ngo. Quote, when you enter our home, you play by our rules, not yours, the Northeast Antifa social media account posted. Quote, New England is anti-fascist, and we will hold that line until death, unquote. Some of the groups discussing the event online are encouraging people to wear black and cover their faces to be protected from later prosecution. The Green Mountain John Brown Gun Club stated online it called up reserves to be on hand for the event. A member of a Portland, Oregon Antifa group, Jonathan Dylan Chase, is offering money for anyone who managed to assault Ngo during his Dartmouth appearance. That's the end of the quote from the news report. If you follow my work, I'm sure you've seen me document the photographs, names, and charges of those arrested at various Antifa and far-left riots. You'll notice that almost all of them are young, white, and wear their dysfunctions on their faces. While claiming to be militantly anti-racist, these white people threaten violence against two people of color, one of whom, me, is gay. On the subreddit for the Socialist Rifle Association, they had called for comrades to oppose this event, and the comments there are disturbing. I'll read a few of them. Quote, yeah, people are going to end up dead and in prison for countering fascists. We are the revolutionary left. That's just how it is. Instead of running away because you are scared of getting scratched, you should stop the people organizing to kill you, unquote. Another comment. It's a good show of community and solidarity when everyone shows up for pest control. Other commentators talked about being armed and the need to redact me from this earth. You see, despite what they say and what they do, Antifa are able to operate in the mainstream because they deceive the public. If you read the headlines in establishment press, you'll see like this. These are a couple of headlines from 2020 after the riots had broken out across the country. One's from AP, one's from the New York Times. Antifa don't want you to see their violence, which is why they beat journalists like myself for reporting them in public. They want you to think they're anti-fascist, anti-racist heroes protecting people who look like me from white supremacists. It's all smoke and mirrors. For their own admission, violence and threats is how they'll achieve their goals of an anarchist communist revolution. I'm going to play for you one of the audio compilations I put together last year of phone calls I received from Antifa militants in one night. Is this not playing?
It's a little rough.
Sorry, there's some technical errors. If you couldn't hear that or watch that, you can find out on my YouTube channel. It's just a compilation of, in a coordinated fashion, multiple people making threats against me, making threats on where they can find me and that they're looking for me. And some of this graffiti you see here is an example of what they write around Portland. I mean, what they do is they accuse their opponents of what they do. They accuse Gabriel and I of, by speaking at this event, that we are organizing for their death, which is actually untrue. State for the record, as I've always done, that I reject political violence in all forms. And so, and what Antifa then do is make up lies about me, but you can see from their own words and in their own writings that they are the ones advocating for the murder of their political opponents and have times actually carried it out against other people. So just to back up a bit, like Antifa didn't just come out of nowhere. Most people probably didn't really hear about them until starting around 2017. And that's because they became really mainstreamed after Trump was elected, not because they didn't exist before that, but they now sort of had a mandate from the mainstream left to join in the quote #resistance. And the left was using a lot of very extreme terminology to resist the last administration. And that made them much more tolerant of those further to their left who advocated and used acts of violence. But Antifa's history. So to state simply, their goal is to agitate leftist uprisings against the state. And they want to overthrow the US government in particular and bring about a revolution. And this is an MO that's been with them since their founding nearly a century ago. The first Antifa group was called the Anti-Fascist Action. It was founded in 1932 in the Weimar Republic as a violent paramilitary of the German Communist Party. They were involved in really violent political street balls and worked to undermine the social democratic government of the Weimar Republic. They wanted to overthrow the center-left government because it wasn't leftist enough. They wanted a communist revolution and they were willing to die and kill for it. And Antifa won't admit this today, but their predecessors actually paved the way for the rise of Hitler by creating a political climate for political polarization and instability. After the Second World War, the Antifa ideology of the communists was absorbed into the official state ideology of East Germany. In the name of anti-fascism, the East German regime built walls and barriers to imprison their own citizens and prevent them from escaping. The most famous or well-known of the walls was the Berlin Wall, which was officially called the Anti-Fascist Defense Barrier. Today, Antifa and their allies are using racial divisions to foment hatred against this country. They've achieved a lot of success through adjacent leftist ideologies like critical race theory, and they have many allies in the press who will propagandize on their behalf. Antifa and their allies particularly hate freedom of expression because it's how people like myself expose them for the violent frauds that they are. They use violence in the hopes that you'll censor yourself out of fear, and too often it works. If you don't play by their rules, some of them will even try to kill you. In the summer of 2020, a supporter of then President Donald Trump was shot dead in downtown Portland by a self-described Antifa member named Michael Rhino. That's him pictured there. Rhino had acted as volunteer security for BLM during the riots and occupations in downtown for weeks before the shooting. He had multiple run-ins with law enforcement before going on his mission to kill a Trump supporter. The photo on the right was him getting arrested at a riot the months prior to him stalking and shooting dead Aaron Danielson. You see the gun on the ground? It was illegally possessed, and yet his charges were dropped, and then he went on to kill. In Portland, Seattle, and other cities in this country where the progressive left has political dominance, they've turned a blind eye to deadly far left violence and violent extremism. Last summer, an evangelical Christian group was holding a small prayer family event in downtown Portland. They were descended upon by Antifa. Antifa actually threw homemade explosives at the crowd to disorient the families and to shock them before rushing in and pepper spraying their face. The evangelical group's sound equipment was then ripped apart and tossed into the river. Police never responded and no one was ever arrested. This is the political culture in Portland, in an American city. Without ever challenging the First Amendment from a legal argument, the radical left has normalized far less political violence to the point that protected First Amendment activities will be met with violence and you'll be left defenseless and alone if you dare to show up. If you try to protect yourself, as conservative journalist Michael Strickland did in 2016, the local prosecutors will hit you with every charge and you will get convicted. There's a reason Andrew Breitbart's quote, "Politics is downstream from culture," has become a cliche. It's because it's true. When laws no longer have cultural and social legitimacy, their legal legitimacy is challenged as well. Look at how America's cultural shift towards being sympathetic to violent suspects and criminals has led city councils from coast to coast to defund police and make it harder for law enforcement to arrest criminal suspects. In Oregon, Democrat lawmakers passed a law that went into effect this year that banned the public from accessing mugshots. The consequences of weak political leadership that favors far left radicalism and extremism were felt very clearly last year. Over a dozen American cities surpassed their all-time records for homicides. Portland, Oregon was one of them. That's where I'm from. The people responsible for making us less safe haven't acknowledged their mistakes, much less apologize. In regards to Antifa, you don't have to take my word on them. Read their writings and watch their actions captured on video. In the hours after Aaron Danielson was killed by one of their comrades in Portland, I saw them announce this on a bullhorn in downtown, and their response was to laugh and dance and sing. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Gabe Nadales. Now, about 6 years ago, the mainstream left entered into the soft alliance with the radical faction known as Antifa. The two movements had very little in common, except for one thing, and it was their shared hatred of President Donald Trump. Unfortunately, this shared hatred then translated into 4 years of lies, often perpetuated by the mainstream media. In 2017, for example, when Antifa and UC Berkeley was rioting at the steps of the campus, well, CNN reported that Antifa was merely trying to promote peace and inclusivity. In 2018, Time magazine wrote an extensive piece called "On the Streets with Antifa," in which actually it was called "How the Antifa Platoon Helped American Forces Beat ISIS in Syria." But of course, Antifa's never killed anyone before, right? In 2019, again, CNN, reporter Campbell Bell had an extensive mini-series in which he interviewed members of the Redneck Revolt and anti-fascist group, only for one of those very same persons that he interviewed to go bomb an ICE facility in Washington State. But Campbell, of course, called him and his friends the good guys. And then in 2020, mere weeks after Aaron Danielson had been murdered, well, the New Yorker wrote an extensive piece called "On the Streets with Antifa," in which, again, it promoted the lie that Antifa was only promoting peace and inclusivity. You know, Antifa is willing to lie, and we know this now. But what's really disheartening is that the media went along with it because they really didn't like the president and they were trying to get rid of him. And one of the most dangerous parts of radical groups, of extremist groups, is the fact that when you're in them, you don't even realize that you're an extremist at all. And in fact, the reason that I joined the anti-fascist movement was because I believe that I had the responsibility to fight for equality, just as every single one of us has that responsibility. Yet that conviction, it turned into a blindfold. Instead of preaching peace and equality and community like CNN would like you to believe, well, I promoted this dangerous us versus them mentality in which it was easy for me to put on that black mask and participate in the fascist tactics of violence and intimidation. Antifa is a tumor in society that must be eradicated. But if we want a long-lasting recovery, we must work to stop the growth of extremist movements everywhere, because Antifa is only a symptom of this cancerous, self-righteous attitude that so many Americans have now. So today, I want to explain two things. First, I want to explain exactly what is Antifa. And second, I want to make the case against extremist groups, not just Antifa, but just all extremist groups. But now, the best way to understand Antifa is to see it as a movement, not as an organization, which is very surprising to a lot of people. Antifa is not an organization. But what is it? It is a movement. And then within this movement, you have several different radical left-wing groups. Some of them call themselves Antifa. You have Portland Antifa, Rocky Mountain Antifa, Philly Antifa, and many, many others. But the majority of the Antifa groups that exist don't. You have the 161 crew, which 1 is A, for anti, 6 is for fascism, and then 1 again is for action. 161 just means anti-fascist action. But the 161 crew in San Francisco beat up and took out a conservative guy's teeth. But you also have the Redneck Revolts, By Any Means Necessary, and many other groups that still adopt this anti-fascist mentality. But in fact, you don't even have to wear that black mask to be part of the anti-fascist movement. To really be part of Antifa, you have to do two things. First, you have to adopt that anti-fascist mentality, but second, you must also be willing to enforce that mentality. Now, to adopt an anti-fascist mentality seems pretty simple. Just reject everything that is fascism, right? Well, that begs the question, what in the world is fascism? Well, while most of us would think fascism to be like fascist Italy, Nazi Germany, Venezuela, China, North Korea, all of these different examples, to modern Antifa, that is not fascism. They define fascism as anything that has to do with freedom of speech, capitalism, or classical liberal values. In fact, as an Antifa Twitter account said in 2018, the fight against fascism will only be won when the capitalist system is smashed. And they mean smashed, because let's go look at the flip side, the second component of being part of the anti-fascist movement, which is you must be willing to enforce that mentality. In fact, there's this author. He is named Mark Bray. He's a professor right now, I believe, at Rutgers University, and he wrote the book on Antifa, Antifa, the Anti-Fascist Handbook. And on the back of this book, there is this quote from Antifa activist named Murray. And it says, "The reason you fight them by writing letters and making phone calls is so you don't have to fight them with fists. You fight them with fists, so you don't have to fight them with knives. You fight them with knives, so you don't have to fight them with guns. And you fight them with guns, so you don't have to fight them with tanks." Now, at first glance, a lot of people claim that this is a form of anticipatory self-defense that can be boiled down to the phrase of "don't mess with me and I won't mess with you." But that's not what it's saying at all, because there is no conditional statement there. In fact, it can be boiled down to the phrase of "you better sit down and shut up or we are going to make you by any means necessary." But with this quote, you can actually break down quote unquote Antifa activism into different stages. The first stage is intimidation. Then it's physical confrontation. Then it is organized confrontation, then deadly force, until you reach the final stage, which is all-out warfare. And unfortunately, there's this myth out there continually that Antifa has never killed anyone, but it is just false. It's always been false, because from their inception, they have murdered countless people. Andy Ngo already talked a little bit about the history of Antifa. And yes, it started in the early 1930s as the military wing of the German Communist Party, the Anti-Fascist Action. One thing he didn't mention is who was funding the Anti-Fascist Action in the Communist Party. Well, it was the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union here already, the ones who sent their external prime minister to the League of Nations to advocate for Antifa, under this regime, they had already murdered millions of people. But even then, we don't have to look far for modern Antifa killings. I mean, in the 1980s, you had the Red Brigade in Italy killing dozens of people, including the Italian prime minister. In Spain, you have the 1st of October anti-fascist resistance groups killing, again, dozens of people all the way until 2007. In Mexico, what's it called? Can't remember the name. And then, can't remember the name. There's an anti-fascist group in Mexico in 2012 that killed a Mexican scientist and bombed a laboratory that killed several others. And even here, Andy already mentioned several different instances. One thing he also mentioned in that we received a lot of death threats for this event. There's this myth out there that Antifa is not willing to kill, and it is just a myth. They are really willing to murder people to get their point across. And all these left-wing commentators who say that, oh, Antifa just advocates against fascists. If you're anti-Antifa, it's because you're a fascist. Well, you have to remember that in World War II, there was two factions which were anti-fascist. You had the American, Canadian, and UK forces, the Western world, who was fighting against Hitler, but they were also fighting the tyrannical Red Brigade. That's the real precursor of the historical Antifa. That's where it comes from. And one of the things that I often get asked is, what did I do when I was part of the anti-fascist movement? And I'm very happy to say that I actually wasn't as involved as some of my colleagues, some of my friends. The worst things that I did was break some windows, spray paint. I was involved in some tumultuous rallies, if you will. I'm really happy that I never crossed that threshold of hurting another person. But at the same time, it should be self-evident to anyone that Antifa is not doing activism at all. It is doing domestic terrorism. With that said, though, a lot of you must be wondering how in the world that I even got involved in the movement. But most importantly, how did I get out? Well, the first time I put on the black mask was in 2011, when there was a neo-Nazi rally coming to my community in Claremont, California. And I remember that at this point, I had been an activist for a couple of years now. And, I couldn't believe that there was real Nazis coming to my community. So I got fired up. I knew a little bit of the history about Antifa from some of the music that I listened to. So I decided to just show up dressed in black with a bandana on my face to see what I could do and see what I could find. But as soon as I got to the park, I didn't really know where to start. So I just stood under a tree. And I have to admit, it was a little bit awkward because I really didn't know what I was going to find. I thought I was the only person dressed in black. Now, it didn't take long, though, for another anarchist, another person dressed in black, another member of the anti-fascist movement to come up to me and ask me if I wanted to join him and his friends to oppose the Nazis head on. That's how you join an Antifa faction. It's very simple. And for well over a year and a half, I was ready at a moment's notice to put on that black mask and participate in what we call direct action, which is where you don't ask for change, you take it. To give you an example of some of the things I used to do. There was once this company in California that they said that my friends told me that they were transporting monkeys to America to conduct vivisections. Now, I absolutely love animals. And at the time I was vegan. So we wanted to do something about it. But an activist, again, they don't just make a phone call or maybe protest outside. They go out and intimidate. And that's exactly what we did. We would go to the home of the CEO and then harass him outside his house, in front of children, in front of his friends, in front of his neighbors. We didn't care. And we threatened that if he did not do exactly what we wanted, then we would come back. Now, fortunately, around this time, I was learning a lot about free market ideals. And I was particularly interested in intellectuals like Milton Friedman and Thomas Sowell. Now, I think that these people are great now. But at the time, I have to admit, I didn't like them. But I found them interesting enough that I wanted to talk about their ideas with my friends. Well, who were my friends? Other members of the anti-fascist movement. Well, for being an anarchist at the time, that was the very first time I was called a capitalist pig, just for asking questions. And then that's when I really began to realize that these were not people I wanted to hang out with. I didn't want to be friends with people who just start being rude and obnoxious and even threatened to do harm against me just because I was interested in ideologies that were not our own. Now, fortunately, again, around this time, I was starting college and I decided to start a libertarian club. Now, a lot of people find it incredibly weird that I would start a libertarian club as a left-wing activist, but this is actually a lot more common than you may think. In fact, the first time that I talked about my Antifa speech was in Sonoma State University, a little bit north of San Francisco. And I remember there was this girl there who, after my speech, she asked me a question, and I'm paraphrasing, and she said that the only reason she attended that speech is because her friends who were members of the feminist club told her that I was going to spew a lot of anti-women propaganda. Now, as you can tell, I'm not talking about women's issues at all. And she thought it smelled a little fishy, so she decided to come. When you tell someone not to look, they're going to want to look. And that's exactly what I did. And even though I was still left-wing leading this chapter, just so I could talk to conservatives and to libertarians, I realized that this ideology was not just present in Antifa, the trying to silence others, but also in a lot of left-wing campuses, specifically what I faced. We lost our advisor numerous times, which is unfortunately a problem that so many conservative students face. Our last advisor, he told us that numerous times the administration told him that if he wanted a future with the school, then he needed to stop being our mentor. We were incredibly lucky because he did not back down and we were able to do activism. But now, some of the activism that we used to do was involved like the national debt, freedom of speech. But some things were very local, not worth mentioning too much. But we also protested the student government anytime they did something we didn't like. Shouldn't be enough to mention it, but I am, because that was enough for an administrator to come outside and threaten to sue us. They are willing to use any means at their disposal to try to silence freedom of speech or speech that they don't like. Fortunately, we were in contact with some attorneys at the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education. And we were able to fight back, and we told them that they had absolutely no right to silence anyone on campus. It doesn't matter if they were conservative or liberal or whatever, they were going to allow everyone to speak. The reason that I joined Antifa is pretty simple. I thought that I was doing good by fighting for equality, but the way they were doing it was detrimental to society. And I mean, the reason that I left Antifa was just because I wanted to talk to people and not be silenced. But the reason that I became a conservative activist was because I realized that the campus left was trying to silence dissent just the same. And the Antifa problem, unfortunately, comes from the fact that we have forgotten how to be decent human beings. People often willfully deafen themselves with their self-righteous ideology, and they refuse to empathize with the other side. We try to remove their rights, say that they don't have a right, like fascists don't have a right to speak, while participating in those same actions that they would call tyrannical if they were used against them. There has to be a better way to really tackle this problem. And fortunately, I think that there is. And it's really freedom of speech. When we look at someone from the other side of the political aisle, we should not look at them as Republican or Democrat or liberal or conservative. We should look at them as human beings who are entitled to an opinion. Because partisanship divides nations. We need to put people first and politics second. Now, I'll tell you one last story, which I think truly encompasses this idea. It is in 2020, I had the opportunity to be interviewed by Joe Thomas. Right before the interview, I found out that he was at the Charlottesville riot. And at first I thought to myself, why am I talking to this gentleman if he was at Charlottesville? But then I found out that, that's his hometown. That's where his news show was from. So as a journalist, he decided to go there and recover the news, right? Well, he was telling me that as soon as he showed up, he was pepper sprayed and doused with urine by the Black Lives Matter movement and by Antifa. As he puts it, there was this young man who was about to beat him down when another person stopped him. His name was Hawk Newsom. Now, Hawk Newsom is the leader of the Brooklyn Black Lives Matter movement. He's gone on Fox News and threatened to burn down this system if he does not get what he wants. Why would Hawk, a left-wing radical, protect a white Joe Thomas? Well, I also found out that Hawk and Joe had met a few years before at the 2016 Democratic Convention. And again, Joe was interviewing people and he interviewed Hawk. And after their 10 to 15-minute segment, they started talking. You would think maybe they're talking about Hillary, maybe they're talking about Trump, it's politics, right? No, they were talking about coffee and their children for over an hour. it was that moment of humility where Joe treated Hawk not as a political opponent, but as a decent human being who is entitled to an opinion, and just as a decent human being in general, that ultimately saved Joe Thomas a few years down the line. We need to listen before speaking. When it comes to our own free speech, we need to be open, respectful, and honest about our beliefs, because the more we start trying to attack something, the more pushback we're going to get. And unfortunately, Antifa believes in this fairy tale that with enough punches, they can beat fascism into submission. And in fact, Mark Bray, he writes in his book that at the heart of the anti-fascist outlook is a rejection of the classical liberal phrase that I may disagree with what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say. But whenever Antifa beats up a fascist, or whether they're innocent or not, they're not winning. They're only creating a people who are resentful and who are apt for radicalization. And then there's those people out there who are a part of the media who believe maybe that they're not, that maybe they may not be pro-Antifa, but then they're using the same tactics of censorship, but through the legal system. And they think that that's the way that you beat down extremist views, but they are dead wrong. Because as President Barack Obama said in a 2011 speech to the United Nations, efforts to restrict speech can quickly become a tool to silence and oppress minorities. The strongest weapon against hateful speech is not repression, it is more speech. The voices of tolerance that rally against bigotry and blasphemy and lift up the values of understanding and mutual respect. Ultimately, if we want to build a better society and rid ourselves of extremist groups from both the left and the right, we need to embrace one of the things that made this country the greatest country in the world. And it is the idea that we have the right to agree to disagree, and it is called freedom of speech. Thank you. Andy and I will now take some questions from the audience.
Yeah, hi guys. If you haven't already, drop a question in a chat. We're going to try to answer them the best we can. We're going to try to get through a few of them for about 10, 15 minutes.
Questions. Could you read some questions?
Yeah. So here's a question for you, Gabe. Which faction / cell of Antifa were you a part of?
Sure. I was part of Capital A, as well as friends with people who were a part of the ABC, the Anarchist Black Cross, as well. I had a friend who was part of the ALF and ELF, and they would invite me to do a lot of activism with them all throughout Southern California, Orange County, the Inland Empire, and those.
And then this was a question directed towards Andy, but why do you think the moderate left does not speak out against this? I get why the far left does not, but why is the center left?
Well, the culture of the left has shifted. That Overton window is where it's drawn is actually where it begins and where it ends is very important. And I don't know, I don't think the mainstream left and journalists who work in media noticed it as it was happening, but for me as somebody who was outside and was looking in, I did. You could see the transformation, for example, in the opinion sections of papers or records. They would gradually be willing to run pieces that were more and more radical, such as pieces that made defense of looting and vandalism and other violent criminality when it's done in the name of racial justice, social justice, or anti-fascism. They introduce ideas of race segregation in the name of Black liberation. And New York Times infamously ran a piece where a Black parent questioned whether or not he wanted his son to have white friends. So these changes in the culture of the left matter. And it makes it so once one of them is willing to say something radical in the mainstream, then others begin to speak out, and then it becomes less and less taboo. But even before that, during my speech, I talked about the terrorists, convicted terrorists from decades ago, I mean, what happened after they served their time in prison is that they ended up going to very respectable positions in the mainstream, such as academe. Bill Ayers went into academe, Bernadette Dorn as well, Chester Bowden's mother. And so the mainstream American society has a short memory, and they're very much so willing to forgive even deadly violent acts that are carried out by those on their side.
And then
Here's another question for you, Andy.
why do you keep yourself from being intimidated by the very real threats of violence which have been made to you and which sometimes have been acted out? Additionally, would you say that Antifa, their tactics, and their ideological foundation are sanctioned or implicitly supported by other more common beliefs in our society? Are these acts of political coercion or terrorism by Antifa only the logical conclusions of such mainstream and accepted beliefs?
Okay,
Two questions there. I'll see if I can remember all of them by the end. The first one, why do I essentially continue doing what I'm doing despite the multiple assaults, traumatic brain injury, hospitalizations, continued death threats against me, as well as my loved ones? Well, I do it because I have gratitude to this country, and I feel I owe the United States. Gabriel is an immigrant. I was born in the US, but my parents were immigrants. I mean, it's just a few years before I was born that my parents came as refugees. So when you come in as essentially as a guest to a country, and the country welcomes you wholly to become equal citizens, and either you or your children then end up doing very well and benefiting from society, I think you owe it to make sure that that's preserved for future generations. And what I see as a truth seeker, as a journalist, is that we have a threat to the American system, and more broadly liberal democracy. That's very different from capital L liberalism. I'm talking about rule of law, elections, free speech, protection of freedom of expression. I think all of it has been under threat for a while, but it's the attacks on it really accelerated after Trump was elected, not because of Trump, but because reaction against him. People on the left just excuse all matter of excesses in the so-called hashtag resistance. I forget can you repeat another part of that question?
Yeah.
I forget it. Did you want to weigh in at all?
Yeah, on that first part, I think that so many Americans, you guys take your rights for granted. America really is the greatest country in the world. And that a lot of people will say, well, we don't do well in X, Y, and Z. And we forget, well, why? And the United States has its problems, of course. But from an outsider looking in, you guys are blaming the wrong things. A lot of people in Antifa will say that, oh, it's freedom of speech, that's the problem. That's why extremists are out there allowing themselves to speak. No, it's you guys. Antifa is really creating the right. And unfortunately, the extreme right also creates Antifa because those feed upon each other. And when you're talking about poverty and you guys are blaming capitalism, that's not what it is at all. There's so many other countries that don't embrace capitalism, that are closer to socialism. And guess what? The United States is doing better. And a lot of people will point to countries like Norway, some of the Scandinavian countries, and they'll say, oh, those are perfect examples of socialism, that we should move towards that model. And they'll say that capitalism is failing. The reason so many times that America is failing is not because we are not embracing socialism. It is because we are embracing it in much different ways than other countries. People talk about free market healthcare. We don't have free market healthcare. It's extremely regulated. It's not socialism, but it's regulated. Just to give that example, if we were to move to a more free market, we would have a lot less things cost a lot less. One reason is because you're not really paying for healthcare. You're paying for the people who are in the insurance companies. They don't really care. Pills are freaking cheap, but you have to pay a lot to insurance because they have to pay their employees that have nothing to do with the actual healthcare you are receiving. And that's just one example. So many people in America don't know what they have, and they're ruining it, unfortunately.
Right. And then here's a question directed towards both of you. I think it's very good in light of everything that's happened tonight. What would be your advice to students who are afraid to speak their political beliefs on a campus that is generally intolerant to anything besides Democrat beliefs?
I'll let you start.
Yeah, I've been an activist for about 16 years, a college activist for about, I want to say, we're going on almost 10 years now, 9 years, but almost 10 years. And it is very difficult to be a conservative on college campuses because you're afraid that you're going to be graded wrong. Or I had an example. There's a student that I used to work with from Virginia, and she was asked to write a paper on extremist movements. And she decided to choose, what was it? I think the Black Liberation Army, or one of those, you may have mentioned them, but it was one of those groups that happened to be, the members happened to be African-American. And the professor, assistant professor, gave her a very bad grade because you can't be racist against whites, apparently. It's ridiculous, you know, like the actual professor who supervised the class recognized the problem and gave her the appropriate grade, which is much better than like her, I think she might have gotten a D or something like that. But it's difficult because conservatives have this pressure to self-censor because they're thinking about their future. They want to make sure that they don't have to repeat courses because school's expensive. And they also want to make sure that they don't have violence threatened against them. With that said, I encourage every single conservative student out there to speak out. You have to do it respectfully, and you can't just be an obnoxious kid who just like yells from the back of the classroom. You have to do it in a respectful manner because you'll start noticing that there's other people who are also self-censoring who will thank you and who will feel more comfortable in speaking out. One of the many problems of academia is not just that the left infiltrated and they're imposing their will on academia. It's also the fault of conservatives who just kind of went along to get along and thought it's not a big deal. It's, you know, I'll just move on from this and go on with my life after I'm done with school. No, because they're educating hundreds of thousands of students who are then going into the workforce and injecting woke ideologies into the workforce. If we don't stop it in academia, it's going to spread everywhere.
I would say that not every person is meant to be an activist, but what every person can do is to be honest to themselves and to others. And one thing that's often overlooked is that you don't want to repeat the mistakes of the other side, which is, I'm sure we all know, people at our campuses who think they know entirely how the world runs at 18 and 19 and 20 years old. And they're so sure of their convictions for these left-wing political views that they're radical and oftentimes are willing to tolerate, if not engage, in political violence. You want to make sure that you are not engaging on the opposite side of that, thinking that you are so sure on your conservative or right-wing beliefs that anything that anyone else has to say is wrong. So you're there to learn. Make sure you do that and be honest to yourself. I think you'll be surprised that you can learn a lot about conservatism by actually watching and listening to what the other side has to say about their own beliefs.
Thanks. I think here's kind of a good changing point too, which is how do you see Antifa changing tactics now that Trump is out of office?
So in my reporting, my book's just is about to come out in updated form in paperback, unmasked. And in the updates, I talk about some of the Antifa activities in 2021. There was a misconception on the right and the left, thinking that, oh, once Trump loses, Antifa will have nothing to riot about and they'll go away. Well, that's completely untrue. In California, the LA and San Diego cells of these Antifa groups have become really activated last year on a number of issues. Some of you may recall what happened with the We Spa in Los Angeles, where a trans woman was alleged to have exposed an erect penis to women and girls in the women's section of the spa. Well, when people came out to protest that, women's rights activists, right-wing activists, conservatives, a number of people. Antifa mobilized and engaged in violence on 2 occasions. And so Antifa have also taken upon themselves to violently oppose protests against COVID vaccine mandates or lockdown measures, etc. So they're constantly shifting the goalposts on who to oppose, because Antifa, by their own definition, only exists in opposition to something. So with Trump out of the office, that was always used as a convenient excuse before anyways, it was never serious. But now they're opposing any number of issues, and they'll continue to be violent, as we've seen in the Pacific Northwest. With that said, I will say that we likely won't see the level of type of violence that we saw in 2020 until there's another viral video that happens to capture some type of law enforcement interaction with the Black Americans. And we can be damn sure that the same people who are involved in agitating for mass uprising and violence will do it again, and will do it with impunity.
You want to add to that? You have to remember what Trump, again, he was just the one person that many people who are part of the Antifa movement try to organize against, but he was just one person. And Trump is not the definition of fascism, according to them. It's anyone who supports classical liberal values. That's capitalism. I remember, it's funny, at UC Berkeley, there's this bookstore. It's called Revolution Books, Antifa Hub. If you go there, you'll see a lot of the major organizers for the Bay Area Antifa groups. And outside of them, they actually had a sign that was very critical of AOC, because her Green New Deal was just a new way of injecting capitalist corporatism into society. They're so far left that even people like AOC can become their targets. So any person who thinks that on the left, who are liberals, who think, oh, they're just opposing fascists. No, they hate anybody who supports the system of government in the United States, because they're in strong opposition to everything that the United States stands for.
And then here's the next one. I think this will probably be our last question for the night, and I think it's a pretty good one. And what would you have to say to the people who feel defeated or overwhelmed by the constant favoritism and acceptance of Antifa groups and actions? What could the average Joes do for themselves as well as their community?
I think that the way to defeat Antifa is to really get involved in your local elections, and you specifically on to get prosecutors out of office. Because one of the problems that happens, especially in Portland, and I think Andy can speak a little more to this, is that the police was arresting people left and right, but then the prosecutors kept dropping the charges. Now, of course, having a president who, like Trump or someone else in the future, another Republican president who takes the threat of Antifa seriously, that would be really, really helpful. But in order to really stick it to Antifa and to make sure that they stop committing violence, is to hold each and one of them accountable. And the way we hold them accountable is by working at the local level. There are so many prosecutors out there who are funded by George Soros, like in Los Angeles, Gascon, and many, many others, who are willing to overlook the left-wing violence because they think it's not a big deal, or they even sympathize with their cause. For example, in 2019, one of my friends, Hayden Williams, he was punched in the face at UC Berkeley. It was a viral video that went viral, and I mean, everybody saw it. Even President Trump saw it. He commented. Everyone thought that we were going to see justice against this guy who committed a felony in broad daylight against a conservative. Well, the prosecutor told Hayden that he wasn't going to do anything because there was a schoolyard fight, even though Hayden didn't throw any punches. I mean, this is the kind of the mentality of so many prosecutors out there. One of the first steps we need to do to really fight against Antifa is to get bad prosecutors out of office. And there's a lot of them throughout the country, unfortunately.
Yeah, this happens. Changes have to happen at the local level. I think we saw very clearly in the last administration that even if you have the executive giving speeches about how Antifa is a terrorist organization, it doesn't really matter much, actually. And I would say the net effect of that was it empowered Antifa in a way, because then the press being so reflexive at saying the opposite of whatever Trump said, went further and above and beyond to defend Antifa, to spite Trump. Gabriel laid out all the ways in how local jurisdictions can become corrupt. You have city councils who can restrict how law enforcement are able to perform their duties. They politicize police departments, they demoralize law enforcement. I mean, in Portland, that is the example I'd say look to see like what happens when Antifa's effects beyond rioting affect the local criminal justice system and government. So I've been very pessimistic about the developments in America, and I don't want to be optimistic if I don't feel it genuinely, but I will say seeing many parents being actively involved in what their children are being educated at schools, although that's not directly related to Antifa, how it does connect is that many American children through state schools are being introduced to critical race theory, which is an adjacent ideology to what Antifa believe in today, and it's used to foment anti-Americanism. And it's up to parents to oppose that. So to see that happening in Virginia, and where there were actually electoral consequences of the governor's race, that's encouraging. I hope that more parents become involved, because the thing about the far left is they're very, very, very patient. They're not looking at this 4 years, the next 4 years. You can look at how much they've been agitating for half a century previously and look at the fruits of their labor today.
Well, thanks, guys. I really want to thank you for being flexible tonight. This was not the event that we had planned beforehand, and it really was just such a last minute thing. So I want to thank you guys for being flexible and being okay with changing it to a virtual setting.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. It's great to have the opportunity to talk about this.
Thank you. And we, the speakers, apologize that we weren't able to see the people who made the effort and time to come to Hanover, New Hampshire in person. But hopefully this speech was enlightening and interesting for you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I just want to reiterate Andy's point. Our organization feels terrible for those who drove all the way out here only for the event to be, the in-person component of the event to be canceled. We want to apologize to all of you, and we'll be sending some stuff out soon to kind of explain the situation. So thank you.
Thank you.
Croc TV.